Hey guys, tonight we're going to step through a story that's part toxic mystery, part workplace horror, and entirely soaked in wallpaper glue. Imagine tiptoeing across the creaky floorboards of a grand Victorian sitting room, gaslights flickering, the thick scent of damp paper and floral perfume clinging to the walls. Your only job? To press your face closer, and take a deep, deliberate sniff of the wallpaper. Sweet almond? Faint vinegar? Something vaguely metallic and wrong? You've just risked your lungs, your sanity, and quite possibly your life, for your paycheck. That's right, you are a professional wallpaper sniffer. And you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the fog-drenched streets of 1860s London, boots slick with coal soot and the sour residue of a city still learning what hygiene means. Everywhere you turn, the walls are alive, not with insects or mold. Well, okay, sometimes with mold, but with patterns. Vine leaves curling like serpents. Paisley blossoms exploding across drawing rooms. Stripes bold enough to hypnotize a vicar. Wallpaper isn't just decoration anymore, it's an obsession. And you? You're on the front lines of that obsession. Not designing it. Not hanging it. No, your nose is your most valuable asset. Your job begins in the parlor of a merchant's house. He's proud, smiling, gesturing at the newly papered room with a flourish. Imported from France, he says, patting the wall. But something itches in your sinuses. A sharp scent. Almonds, but wrong. Not the bakery kind. The kind that makes the back of your throat tighten. You nod politely while mentally filing this one under. Probable death trap. That almondy scent? That's arsenic trioxide, baby. Known back then as Sheely's Green, it gave Victorian wallpaper its most fashionable shimmer. Emerald, mint, seafoam, all those lush hues hid a sinister truth. They were loaded with poison. Literal poison. The kind used in rat traps and unfortunate novels. The kind that, when mixed with wallpaper paste, could slowly gas a whole family with every damp day and coal-fire foggy night. You weren't always a sniffer. No one grows up dreaming of becoming one. But after a short stint selling cravats, then a long spell coughing in a match factory, the sniffer gig seemed, well, novel. You get to wear a waistcoat. You get to visit respectable homes. You get tea sometimes. Just ignore the headaches. And the nausea. And the occasional hallucinations. Occupational hazards, right? Your friends think it's absurd. You sniff walls? One of them asks over a pint. Like a dog? Another laughs, miming it dramatically until he chokes on his ale. But you've read the medical pamphlets. You know what's out there. One doctor described entire households wilting like flowers, faces green-tinged and breathless. Children with mysterious rashes. Cats dying in corners. Wallpaper was the silent killer. Historians still argue whether the danger was as widespread as reported, or if moral panic and bad plumbing played just as big a role. After all, Victorian homes were basically arsenic bingo. Paint, candles, even some soaps had it. But the wallpaper? That was the big one. It off-gassed when it got damp. Which in foggy Britain was always. You pass another parlor. This one's different. A faintly sweet odor, but muted stale. The pattern? Foxgloves on a plum background. Very on trend. The lady of the house seems pale. She says she's had nerves lately. Fainting spells. You resist the urge to tell her the foxgloves might outlive her. You keep a small notebook tucked into your coat. Inside, scrawled notes. Green stripes, mint odor, mild metallic after smell. Recommend removal. You use a scratchy pencil stub, and the pages are wrinkled from pocket heat and wallpaper paste smears. You make sure to underline the worst samples. Sometimes you send them off to a lab, though the lab is just a curious apothecary who once did a summer in Germany. You think of quitting often. But what else is there? and besides, it's become a mission now. The more walls you sniff, the more patterns you memorize, the more lives you might save. You're no hero, but neither are the manufacturers who keep selling this stuff while pretending it's harmless. One time, you visited a nursery. The wallpaper was bright with animals, parrots, rabbits, lions. A cheerful jungle. The scent hit you like a slap. 2 weeks later, you heard the child had taken ill. You still remember the lion's eyes, too bright, too gold, like it knew. The job gets to you. Sometimes, even when you're home, you imagine the smell. You sniff your curtains. You scrub the walls. You boil vinegar in a pan to clear the air. There's talk of legislation. Some members of parliament are on your side. But others laugh. Are we to regulate scent now? They asked in parliament, twirling their mustaches. Still, slowly, the tide turns. Public health advocates begin collecting horror stories. Anonymous letters arrive at newspapers. My daughter's room was newly papered. 3 weeks later she could no longer stand. Those get attention. You clip them out, paste them in your book. You're not alone anymore. There's a whisper network of other sniffers, men and women, in London, Manchester, even as far as Edinburgh. You swap stories when you meet. Which pattern made you dizzy? Which one turned your fingers numb? Which one made the inspector faint? You wonder often why it took so long for people to care. Maybe it's because wallpaper was beautiful. A symbol of taste and status. It hid the cracks in the plaster. It made rooms feel alive. And who wants to believe something lovely might be lethal? So you keep walking. Keep sniffing. This city is wrapped in color and danger. But someone's got to nose out the truth. You're back in the streetlight glow of another foggy evening, and it's not just the wallpaper that's thick around here, it's the expectations. Everyone wants their home to be more than 4 walls and a roof. They want fashion. Comfort. The sort of lavish interiors you'd see in the illustrated London News or gawk at in shop windows on Regent Street. The wallpaper is not just paper anymore. It's personality. And in Victorian society, personality is everything. You duck under a painted sign reading, Morris and Company. Yes, that Morris. William Morris himself. The poet, the designer, the man who practically launched 1,000 wallpapered parlors. His designs are different, earthy, tangled, alive. You don't have to sniff these. Not today. They're famously free of arsenic. A bit smug about it, too. But before Morris turned wallpaper into an aesthetic manifesto, things were less idealistic, and far more dangerous. Let's rewind. Mid-1800s. Wallpaper isn't new, but suddenly it's everywhere. Advances in printing mean you no longer need to be rich to afford it. The block prints give way to roller printing, faster, cheaper, and oh so tempting for the working class. By the 1860s, you could buy a roll at the ironmonger's. Whole walls could be transformed in an afternoon. Even if your walls were cracked and crumbling underneath, slap on a few yards of fern-patterned brilliance and boom, bourgeois transformation complete. And what were people choosing? Nature motifs, mostly. Flowers. Leaves. Vines curling up like gossip at a dinner party. That's no coincidence. The Victorians were plant-obsessed. Fern fever was a thing. Seriously, pteridomania, the compulsive collecting of ferns. You've probably never feared being out-botanied by your neighbor, but they certainly did. Wallpaper helped bring the outside in. Only, unlike a nice daisy in a pot, the pigments used on wallpaper weren't always friendly. That soft sage green might be dyed with verdigris, a copper-based pigment. That deep crimson damask could be laced with mercury sulfide. And that shimmering emerald, the one that caught the gaslight just so? Well, as we've already whispered, arsenic. But no one's reading labels. There are no labels. You hold up your candle to the wall and admire the shimmer, not suspecting that the shimmer might one day stop your heart. Historians still argue whether this surge in wallpaper mania was driven more by class anxiety or the need for privacy in overcrowded cities. Probably both. You think of your own rented room above the butcher. Thin walls. Thinner floors. Wallpaper isn't just decoration, it's insulation from the neighbors and a sign that you're trying, at least. You can't afford a piano, but you can paste some birds on your walls and pretend. You remember the catalogs, cheap ones, mass-printed, full of promises. Saxon ivy, Florentine scroll, celestial blue with star points. Some sold patterns with little angels, others with giant peacocks. You saw one with foxes wearing waistcoats once. Questionable taste, but no judgment. The real flex? Matching your wallpaper to the season. Pale pastels for spring. Rich, cozy browns for autumn. Winter brought heavy velvets and dark green, if your lungs could handle it. Summer? Summer was the worst. That's when the damp hit the walls and the invisible gases started their slow hiss. You knew a family who repapered every year. Not because they were fancy, because the last year's pattern had gone sour. That's what they called it. Sour walls. You lean against one now. A dusty boarding house near the docks. The smell? A little sweet. A little sharp. Someone's cooking onions upstairs and it mixes in a way that makes your stomach turn. The landlady tells you people are getting sick. You nod. She offers you a ginger biscuit. You decline. You don't eat on sniffing days anymore. And let's talk about the people behind these walls. Not just the sniffers, not just the chemists, but the paper hangers. Working men, skilled but overexposed. They'd cut the paper, mix the paste, sometimes made with flour and water and left to ferment for days, and slap those rolls up fast. If a pattern bubbled or curled, they'd scrape it off and start again. No masks. No gloves. Just a bucket, a brush, and a prayer. Some of them started complaining. Nosebleeds. Burning eyes. Weird dreams. One wrote a letter to the local paper saying he could taste the green in his teeth. No one followed up. Then there were the factories where the paper was printed. Women working in the pigment rooms would come home with fingers stained green, and not in a fun, paint the garden shed kind of way. Their skin blistered. Their breath turned sour. Their hair fell out. One doctor nicknamed it the green sickness. And no, it wasn't envy. Still, people bought more. Wallpaper became a kind of disease you welcomed into your home. And not just in England. The craze hit Paris, Vienna, even Boston. Everyone wanted a bit of that leafy elegance. You imagine a world map covered in floral brocade, toxic vines stretching across oceans. And then came the branding. Pattern names got fancier. The Persian willow. Venetian gold. Even some faux Egyptian designs, because nothing says domestic bliss like ancient tomb motifs. Your neighbor once had something called Zulu sunset. That looked like burnt marmalade, but hey, who are you to judge? By now, the industry was massive. Whole departments in department stores were dedicated to wallpaper. Special women, called paper ladies, would help you choose your palette and then quietly judge your taste. And if your home had more than one pattern, congratulations, you were très moderne. You once met a man who had 6 different patterns in 6 rooms, all greens. He coughed constantly. It's the chimney, he said. You tried not to sigh. This mania didn't come with much regulation. Anyone could open a wallpaper factory if they had enough pigment, paper, and a willingness to ignore the occasional lawsuit. Some companies used arsenic-free inks, but most didn't. Cheaper. Flashier. That was the goal. And besides, who wanted to believe that something so beautiful could be fatal? You walk past a nursery with clown wallpaper. You don't even need to sniff it. The colors are too vivid. The air is thick. You hope the baby sleeps near a window. The truth is, wallpaper became the background of Victorian life, literally. It was the canvas for birthdays, funerals, love letters, arguments, tea spills, and Sunday naps. It absorbed years. And in some cases, it gave something back. Arsenic particles. Headaches. Ghosts of chemical reactions. Still, you understand the allure. You do. There's something soothing about a repeating pattern, about taming the chaos of life into vines and flowers and little golden dots. You stare at a wall long enough, and maybe you start to believe you're safe. But you know better. And your nose? It never lies. You shuffle sideways into a drawing room that smells too clean. Not the warm polish and biscuits kind of clean, but the sterile, chemical kind, like someone tried too hard to disguise something foul. The windows are shut tight. The coal fire crackles. But you can already sense the culprit clinging to the walls like a smug secret. You inch closer to the wallpaper. The pattern's a riot of swirling vines and parakeets. Victorian chic. Your fingers brush the surface, dry, slightly textured, and you breathe in. And there it is, that ghost of almonds. Faint but unmistakable. The pigment practically winks at you. Welcome to the poison pigment problem. See, the Victorians were in love with green. Not just any green, Shelley's green and its shinier cousin, Paris green. Invented in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, these shades had one brilliant quality: they didn't fade. They stayed vivid, even under harsh gaslight. They made your sitting room glow with status. And they were loaded, absolutely stuffed, with arsenic. This wasn't exactly a trade secret. Arsenic compounds had long been known to be deadly. People used them for rat poison, for flypaper, for a wide array of quietly homicidal purposes. But on wallpaper? Well, that was different. That was fashion. You remember the early warnings. A few German scientists sounded alarms in the 1830s. A papermaker in Sweden collapsed in his workshop and died next to a vat of green dye. Even doctors whispered that children sleeping in bright green rooms fell ill more often than others. But as with all good scandals, it took some drama to stir the masses. Historians still argue whether the first confirmed death from arsenic-laced wallpaper was in 1857, when a toddler in England died after licking the walls of her playroom. Some claim it earlier. Others say the real shift came with the Times printing a report that called wallpaper a peril to the domestic heart. Either way, eyebrows were officially raised. You flip back through your own memories, years of sniffing and not-so-quiet coughing. You recall the house with the peacock walls, gold and green feathers, curling across an entire stairwell. The youngest son kept having seizures. The parents blamed bad air. You knew better. The whole staircase reeked of metallic sweetness. But the pigment didn't act alone. It needed a bit of atmospheric encouragement. Enter the Victorian home. Closed windows. Poor ventilation. Damp plaster. Coal fires. It was a perfect storm. The arsenic didn't just sit there politely, it reacted. When moisture mixed with the pigment, it could release arsine gas, a faintly garlicky, nerve-wracking thing. And when that gas built up over weeks or months in a cozy drawing room? Well, that's when things got morbid. And here's the kicker, no one wanted to believe it. Green was too beautiful, too desirable. Even Queen Victoria reportedly had green wallpaper in her palace. To suggest the color might be lethal? That was practically treason. You sit in a public library one evening, reading over a medical pamphlet by Dr. A. W. Hoffman, who delicately referred to the deleterious tendencies of arsenical wallpapers. Another, Dr. Letheby, went so far as to say some rooms could murder a man as silently as the grave. That line stuck with you. Still does. You jotted it in your notebook under wallpapers likely to murder. By now, a quiet battle was being waged. Chemists and doctors on one side, manufacturers and fashionistas on the other. The manufacturers weren't even subtle about it. They insisted their greens were harmless. It's only dangerous if you eat the paper. They'd scoff. One even joked that children should be taught not to gnaw on walls. Sound advice if only children could read sarcastic newspaper ads. You once visited a wallpaper factory in Yorkshire. The air inside stung your nose before you even reached the pigment rooms. Women in aprons stirred thick vats of green paste. Their fingers were stained, blistered. One had a cough that didn't sound right. You asked the foreman about safety. He said, "We offer vinegar water. Cuts the fumes." Vinegar water. That was the defense. In polite society, whisper networks grew. Letters passed between mothers and aunts. Don't trust the green in Eliza's nursery. At afternoon teas, ladies spoke of friends who'd grown pale and wan, whose homes had been improperly papered. Even Florence Nightingale reportedly detested arsenic wallpaper and refused to have any near her. Of course, men in power pushed back. To admit danger would mean admitting fault and triggering lawsuits. In Parliament, the issue came up occasionally, only to be laughed off. Are we to fear our own parlours now? One MP declared, shaking a sheet of vivid sample paper in the air like a flag of defiance. You walk past a middle-class home on Baker Street. You remember the rumor, 3 children bedridden after a recent redecorating spree. The mother insisted it was a passing fever. You took a sample from the kitchen wall, where the pattern was darkest. The test later showed alarming levels of arsenic. You sent a letter. Never heard back. Quirky fact? Some of the earliest safety tests for wallpaper involved hanging a strip in a sealed glass case with a caged bird. If the bird survived, the paper was safe. If not, well, let's just say you stopped trusting parrot-themed designs after that. The irony is, alternatives existed. Safe pigments, less lurid shades, even Morris's famous vegetable-based dyes. But they cost more. And they didn't sparkle. One particularly uncomfortable visit took you into a home that smelled of violets. The walls were green damask. The daughter coughed constantly. The mother insisted the perfume helped. You remember writing in your notebook, "Perfume cannot mask poison." Still, the market bloomed. Wallpaper grew more elaborate, more textured, more dimensional. Some even came with velvet flocking, because what's better than dangerous wallpaper? Dangerous wallpaper that traps arsenic dust in fuzzy, decorative fur. Your job became harder. Not because the scent got fainter, but because denial got louder. You'd issue warnings, and they'd thank you sweetly, then do nothing. Even now, walking past those old houses, your nose twitches. You swear you can still smell it through the bricks. Maybe it's memory. Maybe something worse. You stand outside a townhouse with lace-curtained windows and a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. The kind of place where you'd expect cucumber sandwiches, a maid with sharp heels, and a parlor that smells faintly of lemon polish and pride. But tonight the lady of the house has summoned you, not for your charm, not for your tea-sipping abilities, but for your nose. As soon as she opens the door, you're hit with the scent. It's subtle, almost like crushed marzipan left in the sun too long. Her voice trembles as she invites you in. The drawing room has been unpleasant. That's the word she uses. You can already guess what you'll find behind those velvet drapes and tasteful furniture. Arsenic green wallpaper doing its silent, murderous work. This is what arsenic in the drawing room looks like. It began quietly enough. A rash here, a migraine there. Her husband's cough worsening. The children seeming tired and pale. The family cat dying suddenly and suspiciously near the fireplace. The lady herself fainting during a piano recital. None of it enough to cause panic on its own, but collectively? It starts to whisper something dreadful. You walk in. The walls are patterned in lush green vines, glinting under the chandelier. The scent is stronger here. Almost sweet. Almost cloying. You take out your notebook and pencil, reflex by now, and start your silent process. The lady sits down, nervously adjusting her gloves. This wasn't an isolated story. Across England, well-bred families began encountering the same strange string of ailments. And those who had the time, and the nerve, began writing about it. One such woman, a Mrs. Harriet Orme, wrote to several newspapers after her infant fell ill in a nursery recently decorated with what she called a new and agreeable pattern. She had it analyzed. Arsenic content off the charts. Her letter ended with the question: how many homes unknowingly poison their own? Historians still argue whether these upper-class women were motivated more by maternal instinct or a rising sense of consumer betrayal. Some call it the dawn of domestic activism. Others suggest they just liked writing letters. Either way, their concerns hit a nerve. The medical community slowly joined in. One chemist, Dr. Robert Angus Smith, imagine a tall, twitchy man in too many waistcoats, began testing wallpapers using hydrogen sulfide to release and detect arsenic gas. His laboratory smelled like a sulfurous swamp, but the results were clear: wallpaper was guilty. Unapologetically so. The scandal exploded in 1879 when a little girl from a well-to-do family died suddenly. She'd been playing near the wall. Doctors traced her symptoms: convulsions, vomiting, an oddly sweet breath, and finally pointed at the wallpaper. A quiet funeral followed. No one mentioned the green walls in the obituary, but the house was stripped of all paper within the week. You know. You were there, discreetly hauling samples back to the apothecary in your satchel. There were skeptics, of course. One particularly pompous paper titled, "On the Exaggeration of Domestic Poisoning Claims," scoffed at the idea that wallpaper could bring down the mighty British household. Its author later passed out during a lecture, ironically, in front of a floral green backdrop. Even the manufacturers started to twitch. A few shifted tactics. They began issuing vague reassurances like, "Our pigments are of the highest purity," which meant nothing, but sounded posh. Others simply rebranded. Emerald Delight became Verdant Haze. Still arsenic-laced. Just better PR. You visited a wallpaper showroom once that had "arsenic-free" in gold letters on the window. Inside? Rows and rows of patterns with questionable origins. You sniffed a few. Let's just say you left with a headache, a free swatch, and zero trust. One particularly vivid memory haunts you still. A manor on the edge of Kent. The drawing room wallpaper had a pattern of lilacs and doves. Subtle. Expensive. Lethal. The daughter, maybe 16, was kept in bed with a mysterious illness. They blamed it on female troubles. You nearly laughed. Until you saw the dark circles under her eyes and the blood on her pillow. You remember whispering to the housemaid, "Burn it! Burn the whole wall!" She just nodded. Quiet rebellion in a starched cap. Still, resistance grew. There were women's groups forming, not loud suffragette kinds, but genteel societies, bridge clubs doubling as arsenic awareness hubs. They'd share stories over sponge cake and pass around pamphlets with titles like, "The Deadly Beauty in Your Boudoir." One evening, you attended a quiet salon where 3 women debated whether the crown should intervene. One said, "We must trust the market." Another snapped, "The market's trying to kill our children." The third just sipped her tea and said, "I've switched to Morris. It's simply safer." There was even a push for a national registry of wallpaper pigments. Didn't happen, of course. Too ambitious. But the idea circulated. That was enough. In the meantime, homes grew quieter. People spent more time outdoors. Servants noticed fewer guests, more headaches, strange odors near the baseboards. Some maids began refusing to clean certain rooms. "Makes me dizzy," they'd say, or, "The dog won't go in there." Dogs always knew. Quirky side note. One enterprising clergyman in Bath tried to exorcise a sick room with holy water. When it didn't work, he blamed spiritual forces. You're fairly certain it was just Paris green behind a painting of cherubs. And yet, denial lingered. You recall one gentleman insisting his wallpaper was safe because it had been imported from Austria, as though arsenic had passports. Eventually, the whispers turned into murmurs. Murmurs into action. But it wasn't a straight line. There were still families who chose beauty over breath, color over caution. Some of them still do. You finish your inspection of the townhouse. The lady watches you with hopeful eyes. You gently explain the findings. Her mouth tightens. She thanks you? She'll discuss it with her husband. You know what that means. Maybe nothing will change. Maybe it will. As you leave, the parlor door clicks shut behind you. The scent lingers in your coat. You shake your head, step back into the fog, and wonder how many other drawing rooms are quietly poisoning their guests under the guise of elegance. You're ankle-deep in the slush of a London morning, coat pulled tight, hat tilted to keep out the drizzle. The fog tastes like burnt toast and chimney soot. It's the sort of day that seeps into your bones and refuses to leave. You wipe your nose with a gloved hand, already half numb, and brace yourself. Another appointment, another drawing room, another snuff of potential death. This time, you're not alone. Today, you're shadowing one of the earliest official wallpaper sniffers, not just a curious apothecary or an outraged housewife, but a man actually paid to inhale decor. He's short, buttoned up, and introduces himself with a sniff before a handshake. "Wallace," he says. "Ministry of Health." Unofficially. You nod. There's no need to ask what that means. The government hasn't exactly gone public with the idea of hiring people to smell poison. Not yet. But they know. Behind closed doors, they know. He leads you into a tenement house in Southwark. The wallpaper here isn't grand or glittery. It's brown, peeling, and patterned with faded lilies. You can already smell the damp. And something else, sharp, sweet, and powdery? Wallace steps forward like a detective at a crime scene. He doesn't touch the walls. Just closes his eyes and breathes in. "Florals with a hint of death," he murmurs. And just like that, you're in. Welcome to the world of professional wallpaper sniffers. They weren't many, perhaps a dozen across Britain if that. Often chemists by trade, or doctors on the fringes of respectable science. Some were eccentric hobbyists, others were reformers. And then there were the Wallace types, pragmatic, precise, with an unsettling tolerance for chemical stench. Historians still argue whether these sniffers were truly effective or more symbolic. After all, noses aren't lab instruments. But back then, before reliable arsenic tests, the human schnoz was sometimes the first, and only, line of defense. The work was delicate. Sniffers couldn't barge into homes and shout, "Murder by wallpaper!" No, they needed permission, discretion, and occasionally, bribery. A meat pie for the maid. A sample fee for the landlord. You learn quickly that everyone has a price. Usually pastry. Wallace explains the basics. "It's not just the smell," he says, tapping his nose. "It's how it changes. Day to day. Dry to damp. Cold to warm." He carries a notebook labeled Odorous Variants, S edition. Inside are scribbled notes like pineapple vinegar, sour almonds plus must, and one cryptically marked, "Toad drawer, never again." You ask what that last one means? He shakes his head. Some things defy classification. You take your own notes, but your pencil keeps slipping from your cold fingers. Wallace offers you a flask. The liquid smells like brandy and regret. He's not the only one doing this, of course. In Manchester, there's a pair of sisters trained in nasal chemical inquiry. They work out of a perfume shop by day. In Edinburgh, a failed poet turned sniffer pens dramatic essays titled "Death in the Drawing Room." You read one. It wasn't good, but the sentiment stuck. There's even a whispered legend of a man in Bath who once fainted from sniffing a particular red flocked pattern, and woke up insisting he could smell. Shame. No one knows what that means. But the pattern was discontinued. Most sniffers start out idealistic. They want to save lives. Expose the deadly beauty lurking behind rose bouquets and peacock feathers. But over time, the job takes its toll. Your senses dull. Your headaches grow more frequent. You start to dream in patterns. Once you woke up convinced your wallpaper was breathing. One sniffer, a tall nervous fellow named Elwyn, quit after finding arsenic wallpaper in his own bedroom. "I'd been sleeping in it for 3 years," he said, eyes wide. "I just thought I was melancholy." But the job isn't just dangerous, it's political. There are whispers that wallpaper manufacturers have friends in high places. One sniffer was allegedly paid to not smell a particular set of samples. Another was invited to a lavish dinner by a textile magnate, only to wake up with a bloody nose and no memory of dessert. Coincidence? Maybe. You ask Wallace about it. He smiles tightly. "We don't get medals. Just migraines." Despite the danger, the work expands. Some sniffers are called in for court cases. Landlords sued by tenants. Hospitals accusing contractors. Even a school once, where 3 teachers fainted in a month and the wallpaper was promptly blamed. The scent of learning, someone joked. And then there's the case Wallace tells you about. A home in Norwich. Every inhabitant grew ill. The doctor suspected mold. But Wallace walked in and sniffed. Soap. Soap? You ask? Arsenic soap, he says grimly. Used it to clean the walls. Made it worse. You learn that not all wallpaper was created equal. Certain patterns were repeat offenders. The verdant spiral. Holly glint. Anything with the word viridescent was a red flag in green clothing. Wallace once devised a rating scale: 1-4. Mild nausea. 5-4. Vomiting in hat. And 10-4. Hallucinated opera and possible heart failure. The scale never made it to publication. Quirky fact? Some sniffers trained their noses by smelling old medicinal tinctures. Arsenic mixed with vinegar. Copper sulfate in milk. Like wine tasting, Wallace explains. Only you regret everything. As the day ends, you and Wallace share a bench near the Thames. The fog rolls in, lazy and toxic. He lights a pipe, perhaps to numb the receptors. You wonder aloud if the work makes a difference. He shrugs. We smell. They scoff. Then someone dies. Then they listen. You leave him there, his silhouette a wispy outline in the gray. Back in your room that night, you run your hand across your own wallpaper. It's plain. Brown. Safe. You think. And then, because you can't help it, you lean in and sniff. Just paper. For now. You wake up in the middle of the night, heart thudding. A dream of swirling vines and whispering wallpaper fades as you blink at the cracked ceiling above your bed. The taste of metal still lingers on your tongue. You sit up, light the candle, and rub your temples. It's inspection day. A real inspection, not just a sniff and jot. Today, you're shadowing the full routine of a wallpaper sniffer on official duty, one of the very few men whose entire job description can be summed up as, "Smell this. Try not to die." You meet him at the threshold of a modest home in Bermondsey. He's young, twitchy, with a pocket watch he checks obsessively. Name's Norris. Hair neatly parted, boots too clean. You guess he's new. Probably still believes in changing the world one parlor at a time. It's almost sweet. The landlady greets you both with the wary kindness of someone used to bad news. She ushers you into the drawing room. And there it is, the scent. Subtle at first, like overripe pears. But then it shifts. Almond. Dust. Something sulfuric beneath it all. Norris breathes in slowly, not quite flinching. Let's begin, he says. You watch his ritual. He pulls out a folded sheet of thin linen and holds it just inches from the wall, wafting the air toward his face. Sniff. Pause. Sniff again. Eyes close. He jots down notes, murmuring descriptors like a perfumer. Sweet. Metallic. Slightly floral, damp edge. Then, he moves on to the wall's corner, where the pattern darkens, ivy on emerald. He scratches gently with a blunt blade, catching flakes in a wax paper envelope. Sample for later, he says. Sometimes the smell doesn't reveal the full threat. The flakes sing when you heat them. Historians still argue whether any of this was scientifically sound. Nasal diagnostics weren't exactly peer-reviewed. But in an era before home lab kits and chemical sensors, a sharp nose and a suspicious mind were often all people had. You help him open the window, difficult, rusted shut. The room breathes. The air clears slightly. Norris takes another deep inhale. Less acrid now, he notes. Still unsafe. He opens a small wooden box and pulls out strips of white fabric. The swatch test, he explains. These strips, soaked in vinegar or ammonia, absorb particles from the wall. If they change color, that's a sign. Not proof, but evidence. It's like a chemical ghost hunt. You ask him what the worst case he's seen was. He doesn't answer at first. Just frowns. Then, softly, Children's Hospital in Birmingham. Wallpaper peeling in the playroom. 3 wards shut down. Staff kept fainting. They blamed the heating system. He doesn't need to say more. You nod. The house grows colder as the afternoon drips by. The fire's long dead. Norris doesn't ask for tea. He doesn't eat. He moves from room to room, repeating the process: sniff, swatch, scrape, note. Occasionally he sighs, deep, weary sighs like someone much older than he looks. You trail behind him in the kitchen, where the paper is a mustard yellow print of songbirds. It's peeling near the stovepipe. A child's chair sits in the corner. The smell here is faint, but bitter. Mid-grade pigment, Norris mutters. Probably copper arsenite. Cheaper blend. Doesn't sparkle. Still deadly. By now, your sinuses are tingling. Not from arsenic, probably, just too many hours breathing through tension. You step outside for a moment, while Norris takes the last readings. You stand under a bare tree. The sky's low, the clouds bruised. You wonder how many more homes just like this one are quietly growing toxic behind floral wallpaper. How many landlords know but don't care? How many families blame the flu or weak constitutions? Quirky tidbit: in some places, the sniffers weren't welcomed at all. In Yorkshire, one inspector was pelted with coal after declaring a woman's prized parlour a health risk. She'd papered it herself. Called his report slanderous. Local gossip claimed the inspector's mustache turned white from fear. Probably untrue. But you can't help picturing it. Back inside, Norris has finished. He stacks his notes and seals the samples. The landlady waits nervously in the hallway. Well? She asks. He clears his throat. The wallpaper contains elements consistent with arsenical pigment. There's strong odor presence, particularly in damp areas. Recommend removal and ventilation. She nods once stiffly. My brother did the papering. Used to work at Marigold Prints. Said it was the new autumn ivy. Cost a fortune. Norris softens. I'm sure it's beautiful. But it's also dangerous. As you leave, the landlady says something that sticks with you. Funny how it smells worse when I'm sad. You pause. Norris only nods. Later, you ask him about it. She's not wrong, he says. The worse the paper, the more it affects you, your head, your mood, your nerves. Some call it imaginary. But arsenic plays tricks. Sometimes it whispers before it bites. You follow him back toward the ministry's side office, where his samples will be catalogued, and maybe, just maybe, someone in power will read the report. On the way, Norris tells you he used to want to be a musician. Played violin. Gave it up after his hands began to tremble. He blames years of exposure. But he still smells every room like a maestro listens to silence, seeking discord in harmony. You walk alone after he disappears behind the heavy oak door. The city's walls seem darker now, their patterns suddenly more menacing. You pass a child's shop window, filled with pastel-papered dollhouses. All perfect. All deadly if scaled up. Your nose twitches. Just dust. Maybe. The scandal breaks on a Wednesday. A headline you'll never forget, printed in thick black letters across the front page of the Evening Standard. Is your wallpaper killing you? Subtlety is no longer on the menu. You're standing in a tea shop when you see it, and half the room is frozen mid-sip. A mother lowers her cup slowly, stares at the newspaper, and mutters, I knew it. An elderly man at the counter scoffs. Next they'll tell US air is deadly. But his tone carries a twitch of doubt. This is what it looks like when a profession built around sniffing walls becomes national news. The article quotes letters from inspectors, reports from chemists, and most damningly, testimonies from the sniffers themselves. Norris's name is there, briefly, buried in a paragraph about trained olfactory specialists. But it's enough. You picture him hunched over a notepad, breath held, knowing the tide is shifting. The real trigger? A leaked internal report from the ministry. It detailed dozens of wallpaper samples with confirmed arsenic content, all still available for purchase. Even more damning, it included letters from wallpaper manufacturers urging officials to minimize alarm. Translation: keep selling. Historians still argue whether the leak came from a frustrated bureaucrat, a sympathetic MP's aide, or a sniffer himself. Some say it was Norris. You've never asked him. He probably wouldn't answer. You'd think the news would cause immediate panic. But instead, it causes confusion. People don't want to believe their cozy parlors are death traps. So what follows isn't reform, it's a media circus. Pamphlets fly off shelves. Peddlers sell arsenic-detecting candles that sputter uselessly in damp rooms. One enterprising man in Brighton markets a protective wallpaper cloak, a long linen garment soaked in vinegar. It sells out. People start sniffing their own walls, crouching in hallways yelling, "Smell that?" It becomes an unfortunate hobby. You walk past a bakery and overhear a customer say, "Well, I painted over my wallpaper. That seals it in." The baker nods solemnly. Both are wrong. Then come the counterattacks. Manufacturers publish rebuttals. A full-page ad appears in the Times. "Rumor is not science. Our greens are tested." It shows a smiling child next to a perfectly papered fireplace. The caption reads, "Contentment has no odor." You try not to gag. Even Parliament stumbles into the mess. MPs bicker about whether the government has overstepped by funding nasal-based investigations. One scoffs. "Should we now create a Department of Noses?" Laughter fills the chamber. Outside, 3 more children are hospitalized in a Surrey boarding school. A committee is formed, of course. Committees are always formed. They invite experts to speak. Chemists. Doctors. Wallpaper tycoons in pinstripe suits. And eventually, one sniffer. His name is George Latham. You've never met him, but his reputation precedes him. He's been sniffing since the 1850s. Long nose. Longer memory. The man's practically a legend. At the committee hearing, he sits stiff-backed in a fraying suit and describes, without flair or flourish, how certain wallpapers caused fainting, nausea, even hallucinations. He describes how one homeowner removed the wallpaper from a bedroom and saw her child recover in days. Coincidence? One MP asks. Perhaps, Latham replies. But the air stopped smelling like bitter almonds. He becomes a brief national fascination. Papers nickname him the man with the million-pound nose. A caricature appears showing him sniffing Big Ben. He writes a short memoir, Breathing Danger, which includes such chapter titles as The Wallpaper That Dreamed of Bees. It becomes a surprise hit. And yet, despite the coverage, little changes. There's still no outright ban. The ministry waffles. They release a gentle advisory. Homeowners are encouraged to consider pigment sources. Consider. As though people know what to consider when the salesperson shrugs and says, "It's just green." Quirky moment? One store in Sheffield hosts an arsenic wallpaper bonfire event. Customers bring in samples, toss them into a fire pit, and cheer as the flames flicker green. A doctor faints from the fumes. The papers say he caught a chill. But the sniffers? They're on edge. A few lose work. Norris says a client cancelled after the article, worried he'd find something unfixable. Another sniffer, Elwyn, you remember him from the violin days, sends a desperate letter saying his services are no longer requested. They're frightened of the idea of a diagnosis. He writes. Not the illness itself. Meanwhile, you keep sniffing. House to house. Room to room. Some people are grateful. Some glare. One woman throws a vase. You stop wearing your ministry badge. And then one evening, you attend a public forum. It's in a schoolhouse, packed with concerned citizens. On stage, a chemist, a wallpaper seller, and a woman named Mrs. Bracknell, who introduces herself as a survivor of the verdant bloom pattern. She has the sample in a frame. Dramatic, yes. But she holds the crowd. She describes her family's illnesses, her husband's paranoia, the peeling of the paper, and the sudden clarity when it was removed. The room listens in silence. At the end, she says, "I don't care if it matched the drapes. It killed my roses and nearly killed my son." You watch faces change. Not from data, not from tests. From stories. That night you write in your notebook. Smell may be science, but change is theater. In the days that follow, your work becomes oddly respected again. Quiet thanks. Hushed invitations. Even the landlady from the ivy-draped house writes you a note. "We stripped it. Breathing is easier now." You press that letter between the pages of your notebook, just above a dried wallpaper sample that still smells faintly of almonds. Because even after the scandal fades, the walls still whisper. You find yourself seated at the back of a dim lecture hall, the kind with cracked leather seats and a chalkboard that's seen more dust than discourse. It smells of ink, tobacco, and scholarly delusion. A professor, white-haired and nearly horizontal in posture, rambles about Victorian progress. He praises modern sanitation, applauds factory codes, and chuckles over past misunderstandings. Then he says it. And of course, the whole wallpaper panic, utter nonsense. Most sniffers were hypochondriacs. Hysterics in waistcoats. You lean back, arms crossed, and think, he's never sniffed a corridor soaked in arsenical damp. Because for every noble reformer in a cravat, there were just as many experts, like this one, blind to anything that didn't arrive stamped with a seal and draped in Latin. That's the dark side of Victorian safety. People like to imagine the 19th century as a time of scientific awakening, and sure, germ theory was crawling toward acceptance, and antiseptic surgery was slicing its way into hospitals. But these breakthroughs didn't arrive like lightning. They shuffled in slowly, tripping over centuries of superstition, pride, and the bizarre belief that anything invisible must be imaginary. You once met a public health officer who sincerely believed bad smells themselves caused disease. Not what the smells represented. The smells. Miasmas, he'd whisper, like a spooked vicar. It's why people threw vinegar-soaked cloths out windows and carried pomanders of cloves to purify the air. Not entirely useless. Cloves smell nicer than arsenic, but hardly science. Historians still argue whether the miasma theory helped or hindered progress. On one hand, it prompted cities to clean up sewage. On the other, it delayed germ theory by decades. And it certainly complicated the role of sniffers, who were often dismissed as superstitious servants of the same nose-based nonsense. Yet there was an entire class of professionals whose job, officially or otherwise, was to taste, smell, or touch things no sane person would. You once attended a symposium, tiny, half-lit, held above a public bath, where 3 such specialists gave talks. One was a urine taster. Yes, really. Employed to detect signs of illness before laboratory tests existed. He had a silver spoon and a deadpan expression. Another tested chimney soot in upper-class homes for signs of improper fuel use. He called himself a smoke sommelier. The last claimed he could diagnose a bad mattress by sleeping on it for exactly 3 nights. You admired his dedication to discomfort. Sniffers were part of this strange club, occupations born from gaps in science, from society's discomfort with the unseen. Wallpaper sniffing wasn't a quirk. It was a response to failure. The failure of lawmakers to regulate. The failure of scientists to act quickly. And the failure of manufacturers to value life over lustrous pigment. You remember one boarding school where you weren't allowed to inspect. They laughed, offered you sherry, and called the whole idea urban legend. A month later, the youngest pupils were moved to tents in the garden after several fainted during handwriting lessons. The wallpaper remained. So did the pride. Meanwhile, reformers in other fields were facing their own uphill climbs. One doctor published a list of common urban ailments, and attributed 4 of them to corsets. Another attempted to outlaw child chimney sweeps and was laughed out of Parliament for romanticizing soot. Quirky moment? There was a brief push for aroma ventilation, an idea that homes should be equipped with scent channels, pipes to carry away dangerous odors, or pump in safe ones. Some early prototypes ran garlic through brass tubes. The inventor had no teeth and a cat that refused to come indoors. The Sniffers didn't get that kind of press. No brass tubes. No government funding. Just skepticism and a lot of migraines. Still, you kept working. And slowly, others began to see the logic. Wallpaper sniffing wasn't voodoo. It was, at its best, intuitive chemistry. A pattern recognition of scent and symptom. When you walked into a room and felt the back of your throat tighten, you weren't imagining it. You were detecting invisible violence. Of course, this logic didn't protect you from ridicule. You once testified in a magistrate's hearing about a rental home in Hackney. The landlord accused you of poisoning minds with paranoia. You replied, "Better than poisoning lungs with wallpaper." The clerk laughed. The judge didn't. Afterward, a young man in the hallway shook your hand. "I'm training as a doctor," he said. "They tell us to ignore scent. But my aunt's nursery smelled like syrup and copper, and her baby never woke up." He didn't smile. Neither did you. You begin to collect these stories. Not for publication. Just for remembrance. A catalogue of the ignored. The maid who refused to dust a wall unless it was raining. The priest who collapsed during a wedding and blamed divine displeasure. Not the floral wallpaper behind the pulpit. The theater director who burned the set after 2 actors developed rashes. Each one scribbled in your notebook between samples and sent notes. Then came the push for scientific modernization. The same newspapers that once celebrated Sniffers turned cold. A new generation of chemists emerged, clean-shaven, formal, dismissive of anything they couldn't weigh or boil. They created paper tests. Spot kits. Charts. Good tools, truly. But they dismissed the noses that led them there. Yours included. You began to see fewer clients. Less demand. More sighs. One woman asked if you could just hold the swatch near a light and tell me what color it screams. You said no. She said fine. It stung. Not because you needed the work, though you did, but because you'd seen what the nose could catch before the lab could even confirm it. You were the early warning. The canary in the boudoir. One night, walking home, you passed a news storefront. Scientific interiors, certified non-toxic paints and papers. Inside, a man in a cravat waved samples at a bored couple. You leaned against the window and watched. The walls were white. The air smelled clean. Progress, you suppose? But your nose still twitched. The parlor smells like lavender and quiet defiance. You're sitting at the edge of a rosewood settee, notebook in your lap, across from a woman in pale blue satin who's brewing war in a porcelain teapot. She offers you a scone, asks if you take sugar, and casually mentions that she's had all the wallpaper stripped from the guest bedrooms. Just in case, she says. It gave the dog a rash. Meet the society ladies who fought back. It didn't start as a movement. There were no banners, no marches, no formal declarations. But inside parlors just like this one, over sponge cake and embroidery samplers, Victorian women began comparing notes. They weren't scientists. They weren't sniffers. They were mothers, hostesses, governesses, and a few scandalously well-read widows who'd been told to hush one too many times. And when their children got sick, when their husbands coughed for weeks, when their own skin blistered near the new wallpaper in the breakfast room, they started asking questions. One woman you remember vividly, Mrs. Agnes Harrow, of Chiswick. Large hats, larger opinions. She invited you into her home not for an inspection, but to talk strategy. They think we're being dramatic, she said, pouring tea. So let's be dramatic on purpose. She'd already convinced 3 of her neighbors to remove their green wallpapers and hosted a salon where the topic of the day was why husbands shouldn't choose pigments. Attendance was brisk. She also kept a poison book, where she pasted samples from catalogs she believed were suspect, complete with notes like, smelled of copper in damp weather, and made my niece faint. Historians still argue whether these women accelerated the decline of arsenic wallpaper or were simply reacting to growing scientific consensus. But what's undeniable is this: Once society women began treating wallpaper as a social issue, not just a domestic one, people started listening. After all, these were the tastemakers. Their drawing rooms were featured in gossip columns. Their opinions shaped what was fashionable. If they started whispering that green equals grief, well, that was practically a public health announcement in lace gloves. You start getting more calls, not from landlords or doctors, but from women like Mrs. Harrow. Some requested inspections under cover of secrecy, fearing social embarrassment. Others wore their suspicions like brooches, delighted to tell anyone who'd listen that, "We've gone arsenic-free, darling, it's the latest." One even threw a luncheon with the theme, "Breathable Elegance." She hung muslin over the walls and served all-white food. Bit much, but you admired the commitment. Lavender sachets became a curious weapon in this war. Women tucked them near walls that seemed suspicious, hoping the scent would either mask or neutralize the menace. It didn't, of course, but it was better than nothing. You recall a widow in Ealing who created entire bouquets to distract the senses from the creeping dread of wallpaper. A little dramatic, maybe, but she slept better at night. And then there were the letters. Dozens, no, hundreds, written to newspapers, to pamphlet printers, to neighborhood circulars. Many signed anonymously, or with elegant pseudonyms like a concerned mother or lady of lilac room. They didn't demand revolution. They asked questions. Polite ones. Cutting ones. Might my daughter's consumption be traced to the very decor meant to comfort her? If the walls whisper illness, must we pretend not to hear? Does green wallpaper suit morning gowns by design, or by consequence? The government didn't respond, of course. But the public did. Reading rooms filled with murmurs. Markets saw a spike in pale yellow and cream patterns, safe if dull. Stores began boasting arsenic-free stock with little floral labels. It wasn't regulation. It was peer pressure. You start noticing changes in how clients speak. No longer hushed, guilty, uncertain. Now they say things like, "Of course it's gone. I've children, after all." Or, "We switched to washable paint, terribly modern." There's pride and caution. One particularly wealthy client, Lady Cordelia March, held what she called a paper-peeling party. Servants removed entire walls of green-tinged damask while guests sipped champagne and applauded each thud of falling wallpaper. She handed out small lavender satchels labeled Victory Scent. You still have one. Smells like defiance and dried petals. Quirky fact? The Ladies' Gardening Quarterly began including pigment safety tips alongside rose pruning guides. One issue advised, "If your wisteria wallpaper makes you swoon, consider the Rio Bloom instead." A poem, perhaps, but also solid advice. You suspect some of the movement's energy came from its aesthetic angle. Women weren't told to stop decorating. They were encouraged to decorate wisely. Safer patterns. Lighter colors. More fresh air. In that way, the arsenic scandal became an odd gateway to early environmental awareness, an idea that the home's beauty shouldn't kill. Not everyone approved. One woman's brother called the anti-wallpaper sentiment hysteria with doilies. Another warned that removing paper encourages radicalism. You wish you were joking. But slowly, the wallpaper sniffers started to gain allies in lace and pearls. Women who didn't need lab coats to make a difference. They didn't test samples. They tested patience, asking questions over and over until someone gave an answer. Some took it further. You've heard of a group in Nottingham that formed a wallpaper awareness society. They created a registry of approved patterns, held fundraisers, and even lobbied local governments to inspect tenement housing. They didn't always succeed, but they made noise. You still carry letters from two of them, crisp, well-written notes thanking you for your work and asking for safe recommendations. You replied to both with lists and a warning. If it shimmers like emerald and doesn't fade, be suspicious. One night you attend a poetry reading hosted by several of these women. One stands to read a piece called My Daughter's Wallpaper, and it is equal parts love letter and quiet indictment. You catch your breath on the last line. I thought I'd dressed her room in light. I didn't know I'd wrapped her sleep in fog. Afterwards, she tells you it's based on truth. You believe her. There's still resistance. Not every woman has the means to strip paper or redecorate. Some landlords threaten eviction. But the whispers are louder now, carried by teacups and lace gloves and paper fans. The war on wallpaper has gone domestic. The Sniffers toolkit isn't glamorous. There's no gleaming badge, no ivory-handled instruments. Just a battered leather satchel that smells faintly of vinegar, crushed lavender, and something that probably shouldn't be inhaled. You carry it across London like a silent warning. Inside, your weapons of detection. First, the notebook. Always the notebook. Yours is thick with grime and dog-eared pages, filled with cramped observations, odd metaphors, and a few sarcastic sketches, a drawing of a parlor labeled Death Trap Deluxe, or a caricature of a flustered landlord holding his nose. You've had to rewrite a few entries when ink smudged during one particularly dramatic sneeze. The pages matter. Not just for records but for patterns. You've learned that the ivy and dove motif is more likely to harbor arsenic than the humble vertical stripe. That peacock designs often mean expensive pigments, and expensive doesn't mean safe. You record these things obsessively. Because when you're nose deep in someone's wallpaper, memory matters more than any degree. Next comes your scent library, a bundle of cotton swatches soaked in various test substances. Ammonia, vinegar, even a strange tonic made from crushed garlic and alum. You use them to wake up your nose between rooms, or to check for false positives. You once mistook mildew for Paris green, an error that cost you sleep and a fair bit of dignity. And then there are your samples. In little wax paper envelopes, tucked into a tin box lined with linen, are slivers of wallpaper clipped from corners and behind curtains. Some are labeled simply Sweet, Metallic, Nursery. Others are more dramatic. Sickly almond, Mother unwell. You never carry too many at once. A caution learned after a batch of flakes ruined your coat lining. You still smell it sometimes, like a ghost of bad design. You also carry a pair of gloves. Not for style. For survival. The chemicals in these wallpapers don't just float in the air. They rub off on hands. You learned that the hard way, years ago, after scratching your nose mid-inspection and feeling your eyes burn for hours. A tiny glass vial is your most precious tool. You call it the Sniffers pinch. It contains a few crystals of a reactive compound, hydrogen sulfide, if you're being precise, sealed tight. When exposed to certain arsenical compounds, it releases a distinct, sulfuric scent. Not safe, not scientific, but useful. A litmus test for the brave and mildly reckless. Historians still argue whether any of these tools were truly necessary, or whether the Sniffers simply dramatized their routines to earn trust. Some academics claim the Sniffers toolkit was more performance than procedure. Perhaps. But you know that in the absence of regulation, ritual becomes survival. One colleague you admired, a woman named Isabel, kept her own kit in a floral sewing bag. She claimed it eased the suspicions of housewives. They trust a woman with a thimble, she once said, grinning. She also carried a sliver of lemon peel, tucked in a handkerchief, to clear her nose after strong rooms. Cleanses the palate, she'd whisper, like a sommelier of suffocation. Quirky invention? There was an early attempt at a Sniffers mask, built by an optimistic pharmacist in Whitechapel. It had a brass filter, nose clamps, and a tiny vial of rose oil meant to neutralize odor. You tried it once. You looked like a deranged beekeeper and nearly passed out from rose fumes. It now lives in your satchel as a cautionary relic. But not everything in the kit is strictly practical. You also carry a ribbon, pale green, faded at the edges. It came from the bedroom of a child you couldn't save. You clipped it quietly after the mother wept into your coat. She said, "It was just wallpaper. We thought it would cheer her." You didn't have words then. You still don't. But the ribbon reminds you why the kit matters. Your pencil is whittled short, the kind that smudges easily but fits your grip like a handshake. You've gone through dozens. Once you tried using a pen. The ink froze in winter. You returned to graphite and never looked back. And in the deepest pocket of your coat? A small lavender sachet. Not because it helps, but because it softens the blow. When you enter a home that reeks of artificial springtime and something darker underneath, you press the sachet to your wrist. It buys you a moment. Just a moment. Some sniffers carry chemical guides. You carry stories. Pages filled with rooms you remember not by name, but by scent. The sitting room that smelled like sugared rot, the hallway that tickled your nose with every damp gust, the nursery with a tang of metal sorrow. Your toolkit evolves. After one close call, dizziness, disorientation, an alarming afternoon of seeing wallpaper patterns move, you added charcoal biscuits to help absorb fumes. They don't taste great, but they've saved you once or twice. And now they're standard issue among the sniffing cohort, who've taken to calling them arsenic crackers. A few years ago, a new recruit asked to see your tools. You laid them out carefully on a table, each item precise, worn, trusted. She picked up the sample tin, turned it over in her hands, and said, "It's like a crime kit." You nodded. "Only the walls don't confess," you said. "They just sit there, looking innocent." She smiled, but her eyes were scared. She understood. Because the toolkit isn't about confidence. It's about confrontation. About stepping into rooms people live in, love in, die in, and sniffing for the truth behind the damask. It's about carrying your senses like a weapon. And sometimes, like a shield. And it's about knowing that when the wallpaper gleams and the hostess smiles and the air smells just a little too sweet, your kit might be the only thing standing between comfort and catastrophe. You're standing in a nursery that smells like peppermint oil and denial. The wallpaper is soft green with little silver bunnies leaping across it, adorable, if you don't inhale. You press your nose to the edge where the paper peels just slightly near the skirting board. Sweet. Metallic. You pause. Sniff again. Then blink. Did the scent just disappear? You move to another part of the room. There it is again, faint almonds, a whiff of copper. You make a note. But even as you write, a question hums in your mind. Is this real? Or am I just expecting to smell it? Welcome to the great uncertainty of the nose. This is the part of the job no one wants to admit. The part where your senses falter. Where you start to doubt your own face. Because unlike the cold clarity of chemical tests or X-ray machines, the human nose is a creature of mood, memory, and mischief. Historians still argue whether the testimonies of wallpaper sniffers were ever truly reliable. After all, scent is notoriously subjective. A room that smells like almond to one inspector might evoke wet pennies to another. And in the Victorian era, so rich with superstition, spiritualism, and a flair for melodrama, what if the whole profession was just an elaborate placebo? You've certainly met skeptics. One homeowner sneered. "You lots smell what you want to smell," you replied. "Then you should be terrified." He didn't laugh. But you've also had your own moments of doubt. Like the time you inspected a room while nursing a cold. Your nose was clogged, but you reported a mild scent anyway, too embarrassed to admit you couldn't smell a thing. Or the time you thought you detected arsenic in a wallpaper sample, only to realize it was the tea kettle steaming in the corner, releasing a peculiar kind of mildew. Or the worst time, the phantom parlor. A townhouse in Bloomsbury. Elegant. Recently decorated. Every room smelled fine, except the smallest sitting room at the top of the stairs. There, the scent was unmistakable. Bitter almonds, rot, the sharp bite of copper. You were sure of it. Until the sample tested clean. And then clean again. You returned. Smelled the same scent. But when a second sniffer arrived, she reported only dust and polish. That was the first time you questioned your own brain. Were you being haunted by your own expectations? There's a term some doctors use, olfactory fatigue. It's what happens when your nose, overwhelmed by stimulus, simply shuts down. Sniffers learn to recognize it. You chew coffee beans. Step outside for fresh air. Count to 30 while holding lavender to your wrist. But even those tricks have limits. There's another term, less medical, more poetic, sensory echo. It's when a scent lingers in your mind long after it's gone. Like the way you can still smell smoke after a fire. Or perfume on a scarf that hasn't been worn in weeks. Sniffers live with echoes. You dream in smells. You wake in the night thinking you've caught a whiff of something sinister, only to realize it's the memory of last week's nursery, the one where the mother wept as she stripped the wallpaper herself. You've learned to compensate. You keep a rotation, never inspect more than 5 homes a day. Always bring a second opinion if you're tired. And if you're ill, you don't sniff. You stay home and sharpen pencils. Because false positives do more harm than silence. Still, mistakes happen. One colleague, a theatrical fellow named Pearson, once caused a neighborhood panic after misidentifying a harmless floral pattern as grave-sweetened death. 3 families tore down their walls. One blamed him for the cost. He disappeared from the profession 6 weeks later, reportedly working as a tobacconist in Brighton. You hope he found peace, or at least a less ironic career. Quirky incident? You recall an aristocrat who insisted her walls smelled different at night. You checked them 3 times, nothing. Until one evening, visiting for tea, you caught the scent. It turned out her evening maid wore a hand cream laced with mercury. The walls were innocent. The mystery was not. These are the moments that make sniffing feel more like a seance than a science. You try to stay grounded. You use the tools. You compare notes. You trust your instincts, but verify when you can. Still, there are days you enter a home and feel the dread rising before your nose catches anything. Is it intuition? Or is it the ghosts of 1,000 dangerous parlors whispering back through your memories? You talk to other sniffers when you can. You share stories of phantom smells, mismatched test results, and days where your own breath feels suspicious. Some of them meditate. Others drink. One claims he trained a terrier to bark when it smelled arsenic. You're not sure you believe him, but you wish you did. And through it all, the walls remain silent. They don't explain themselves. They don't confess. You press your face to the flocked velvet and hope your brain doesn't trick you. Because the consequences aren't just professional, they're personal. You think of the families who changed nothing because your report wasn't definitive enough. You think of the ones who did, who tore down the green and lived longer. Or just breathed easier. You remember one woman who, after you told her the sample was inconclusive, whispered, "But do you think it's dangerous?" You had no evidence. No confirmation. Just a scent that danced and vanished. You told her yes. She tore it down. She later sent you a box of chocolates and a letter saying her migraines were gone. Was it science? Was it suggestion? Maybe both. The nose is fickle. It lies. It forgets. It hallucinates. But sometimes, in the right room, with the right paper, and the right gust of air, it tells the truth. And in those moments, you trust it. Even if no one else does. You push open a door that groans like a guilty conscience, and step into a room lit only by a flickering gas lamp and ambition. The shop smells of old paper, dust, and something darker underneath. Maybe secrecy. Maybe profit. It's the unmistakable aroma of black market wallpaper. Because when walls can kill, and bands begin to bite, there's always someone ready to sell danger with a wink. Wallpaper, believe it or not, didn't just fade into obscurity when people got wise. It ducked, dodged, and went underground. And you, as a sniffer, found yourself dealing not just with poison, but with people who wanted to keep the poison profitable. The dealer's name tonight is Mr. Crowley. He has no first name, apparently. Just Crowley. He smiles too easily and wears gloves even indoors. You know the type. He unfurls a bolt of rich, shimmering green paper that looks like it belongs in a duchess's drawing room. It crackles like it's trying to confess. "I call it Venetian moss," he purrs. "Imported. And entirely untraceable. You don't sniff yet. Not here. Not while he's watching. This is what happened once arsenic-free labels gained ground. The manufacturers still holding arsenic stock had to choose, burn it, or move it through the shadows. Guess which one they picked. Historians still argue whether these dealers were directly backed by the bigger companies or just scavengers profiting from factory leftovers. But the effect was the same. Tainted paper found its way back into homes, tucked inside clearance bins, sold under false names or through middlemen. It started small. A few patterns marked vintage stock. Then, limited print. You'd see them in the corners of shops, unlisted in catalogs. The names gave them away: Emerald Legacy, Green Reverie, Moorish Meadow. Beautiful, haunting, and absolutely soaked in arsenic. Manufacturers got sneakier. They forged certification stamps, pasted fake arsenic-free labels on rolls, even created entire fake distributors that existed only on letterhead. You once traced one to an empty warehouse that held nothing but a broken stool and an ash pile that smelled faintly of bitter almonds. That's when you realized wallpaper forgery was now a profession. You began hearing rumors about houses that changed paper every 3 months, each time told, "This one is safe." About decorators bribed to say patterns came from Morris and Company, when in fact they came from a back alley printer using pigment barrels with skulls on them. And then there were the ghost patterns, designs that had supposedly been pulled from shelves but kept popping up in homes. You'd find one on a nursery wall in Oxford, then again in a parlor in Camden, months later. Same swirls. Same shimmer. Same smell. Once you confronted a printer about it. He claimed the design was coincidentally similar. You asked to see his pigment room. He laughed. You didn't. Quirky discovery? Some dealers began creating hybrid papers, thin arsenic prints layered under plain designs. Invisible until dampness seeped through, triggering the chemical reaction. You tested one and felt your skin tingle hours later. It was like booby-trapping wallpaper with aesthetics. And what about those who bought these patterns? Were they ignorant, desperate, or simply enchanted by the low price and high shine? You remember one widow who clutched your wrist as you examined her dining room. "It was all I could afford," she whispered. He said it was harmless. Just a little older than the new styles. The pattern was a classic offender. Olive Bloom, discontinued a decade earlier after 3 cases of poisoning. You advised removal. She nodded, eyes shining, but you knew from her hands, chapped, raw from scrubbing floors, she couldn't afford to repaper. The underground industry didn't stop with the paper itself. It had middlemen who sniffed out estate sales, bought up arsenical rolls from attics and auctions, then resold them under romantic names. Heirloom print, Victorian revival. One dealer even added false, dated 1795, stamps to enhance the illusion of antique value. There was one time, too surreal to forget, when a black market dealer asked you to inspect his stash. For authenticity. You stared at him. "You want me to confirm the poison?" "Exactly," he said, beaming. "Collectors demand purity." Collectors. Yes, by the 1880s, a bizarre subset of society began collecting toxic wallpaper the way others collected stamps. Cabinet curiosities. Decorative horror. You visited one private library where an entire wall was adorned in peacock blue, labeled with a brass plate, Sheely's Green, 1861, donor unknown. It was like watching someone proudly display a loaded pistol with the safety off. Some sniffers tried to intervene. One wrote to a national newspaper, warning of the thriving trade in ornamental illness. He was ignored. Others turned to the courts, accusing specific printers or decorators, but few cases ever reached conviction. Proof was slippery. Denial was easier. And as always, greed was louder than caution. You started carrying a personal blacklist, names, addresses, shops to avoid. Some of them closed. Others simply changed names. Fresca interiors became modern heritage. Same wallpaper. Same poison. One night you were invited to a fancy supper by a gentleman named Donley who claimed to be sympathetic to your cause. Halfway through the soup course, he asked if you'd like to endorse a new brand of wallpaper, guaranteed to only contain trace amounts. You excused yourself through the back door and didn't stop walking for 4 blocks. It was getting harder to tell the safe from the suspect, and the fake from the fatal. You began developing your own code system, scribbled in the margins of your notebook. Flicker equals forged arsenic-free label. Echo equals ghost pattern resurfaced. Moth equals dealer sells only at night. Tea shop Eastgate equals don't eat the muffins. Even your dreams became coded. Patterns chasing you through hallways. Walls that peeled like snakes. A home where each room had the same wallpaper, no matter how many doors you opened. And always that smell. Because in the end, the underground wallpaper market wasn't just about deceit. It was about memory. Some people missed the danger. Missed the shimmer. The weight of status that green once carried. They didn't trust the dull, modern prints. They wanted their walls to feel alive, even if it meant dying with them. You couldn't stop all of them. But you kept the blacklist. You warned where you could. And every time you caught a hint of bitter almonds where it shouldn't be, you knew the underground hadn't died. It had just changed its name. You're in a cramped laboratory, nose wrinkling at a haze of sulfur and boiled linseed oil. The ceiling is low, the walls are lined with stained beakers, and the assistant across from you just sneezed violently into a towel labeled results. You take a step back. Welcome to the moment where the nose gives way to the microscope. This is the scientific pivot, the shift from intuition to analysis, from anecdote to essay. It arrives not all at once, but in fits and chemical coughs, led by a handful of chemists tired of being ignored. At the heart of it? One Mr. Henry Lethaby. Lethaby, a formidable man with a stare sharp enough to cut glass and the patience of an irate librarian, had long suspected that Sniffers were onto something. He didn't mock the almond scent claims. He didn't wave away wallpaper illness as hysteria. Instead, he asked, what if we can prove it? Historians still argue whether Lethaby deserves full credit for legitimizing wallpaper testing. Some say he built on work already done in Germany, others say he borrowed heavily from Sniffers' notebooks. But no one denies his impact. Because Lethaby introduced measurable science to a world soaked in scented guesswork. You were invited once to observe his testing method. You stood quietly as he scraped tiny flecks of green pigment into a flask, added hydrochloric acid, and then, delicately, introduced zinc. The reaction produced a gas, arsine, one of the most dangerous substances known to the 19th century nose. Even in tiny amounts, it had a distinct garlic smell. Breathe that in, Lethaby said dryly, and you won't be breathing much else. He didn't need your nose anymore. He had glass tubes and flame tests and balances so sensitive they quivered at footsteps. It was a little heartbreaking. Like watching someone invent a mechanical violin after you'd spent a lifetime tuning by ear. Still, you couldn't deny the progress. Lethaby's tests proved what you'd always known: arsenic in wallpaper wasn't just theoretical. It wasn't superstition. It wasn't a parlor trick. It was chemical fact. And worse, it was common. He published findings showing that dozens of commercial wallpapers contained upwards of 3 grains of arsenic per square foot. Enough, he claimed, to cause real symptoms over long exposure. Headaches, respiratory issues, even neurological damage. Suddenly, people listened. The newspapers loved it. The wallpapers that kill, screamed one headline. Lethal elegance in the home, declared another. It was scandalous, scientific, and just spooky enough to go viral, in a Victorian sort of way. And manufacturers? Well, they squirmed. Some issued press releases stating they were reviewing pigment protocols. Others quietly discontinued green lines. A few insisted their papers were now Lethaby approved, despite never meeting the man. You once saw a shop proudly display a sign, certified by Dr. Lithbury. The misspelling told you everything you needed to know. You'd think this would be the end of sniffing. That once the scientists stepped in, noses would become obsolete. And in many ways they did. Official inspections began to rely on chemical tests. The ministry started keeping actual arsenic registries. Sniffers were gradually pushed aside, first politely, then with thinly veiled derision. You weren't surprised. Just disappointed. One sniffer you knew, Mr. Owen, The violinist turned toxicologist, tried to learn the new methods. Bought himself a chemistry set, nearly blew out his eyebrows. I miss the simplicity, he said once, holding up his battered notebook. I used to smell a pattern and know something. Now I smell and they say, show us a gas reading. But here's the irony. The new science validated everything the Sniffers had said. Every claim. Every eerie pattern. Every parlor that smelled wrong. The tests confirmed the invisible. And the world finally began to believe. You attended one of the early public demonstrations at a museum. Lethaby himself performed the arsenic gas test in front of a curious crowd. Women in gloves leaned forward. Gentlemen held handkerchiefs to their faces. When the pigment hissed in the vial and released that garlicky puff, the crowd recoiled in synchronized horror. The papers dubbed it the arsenic show. Children begged their parents for safe walls. Shopkeepers began offering Lethaby green, a dull olive shade that became oddly fashionable for about 6 months. You even spotted it in a brothel once, painted across every room. Dead boring, but no one's died lately, said the madam. Quirky twist? With chemical testing came certification agents. They weren't scientists. They were bureaucrats. And their job was to sign off on wallpapers as safe. But the process was slow, underfunded, and full of bribes. You investigated a batch once labeled arsenic-free that turned blue when burned, a known sign of contamination. When you raised concerns, you were told, it's certified. That's all that matters. Still, the wave couldn't be stopped. Wallpaper sales dipped. Especially green varieties. Morris and Company, ever the clever marketers, leaned hard into their plant-based pigments. They printed new catalogs with phrases like, untainted by chemistry. Their sales tripled. And in homes across Britain, drawing rooms grew a little duller, but much, much safer. Your services as a sniffer became niche. Now you were brought in only for nostalgic checks, or to confirm old reports. Once, a museum asked you to evaluate a Victorian nursery before installing it in an exhibit. You sniffed the walls. Still dangerous. Authentic. They called it. One man, wealthy, eccentric, paid you to sniff his collection of forbidden wallpapers. You declined after the second room made your nose bleed. Lethaby eventually retired. His methods lived on. New scientists took his place. Machines improved. But in the footnotes of every lab report, you could still see traces of the nose that came before the math. Some of your fellow sniffers resisted the shift. One wrote a biting pamphlet titled, When Machines Replace Men, The Death of Intuition. It sold poorly. Smelled of desperation. But you chose a quieter route. You started archiving your notes. Indexing patterns. Recording odors. Creating a lexicon of smell. Not because it was still needed, but because you believed, somewhere, someday, someone might want to know what a drawing room of olive bloom on a rainy day really felt like. And more importantly, what it smelled like. Because even as science marched on, and the patterns faded, and the arsenic was locked away in forgotten cabinets, the air still remembered. And so did you. You returned to the old district on a cloudy Wednesday, boots echoing against the wet stone, and realize, without meaning to, that you've walked past 5 houses you once inspected. All of them have new paint now. The bright, intricate patterns are gone. Nothing glimmers green in the gaslight anymore. You stop outside a tiny row home on Henrietta Street. It's freshly whitewashed, the windows cheerfully curtained. But you remember the walls as they were. Verdant spiral. Floral borders curling like secrets. You remember the daughter with the quiet cough. The mother who swore the headaches only started after the decorator finished. The way the wallpaper shimmered when the lamp flickered. That's gone now. Because so are you. Not entirely, not in body, but in purpose. The last of the sniffers are fading away. It didn't happen with a bang. No grand farewell. Just fewer invitations. Slower weeks. Then nothing. Your satchel grew dusty. The pencils dulled. The lavender sachet shriveled and lost its scent. One by one, your colleagues stepped away. Isabel moved to the countryside, opened a perfume shop, and now spends her days crafting fragrances she calls safe rooms. Elwyn finally sold his violin. He said his hands were too shaky now, not from arsenic but from absence. Norris, well, no one's heard from Norris in some time. You wonder if he's retired or simply stopped telling anyone where he went. Historians still argue whether the profession died naturally or was snuffed out by embarrassment. No official decree declared the end of Sniffers. There was no obituary. But as chemical tests got faster, cheaper, more politically acceptable, the Sniffers just vanished. You tried to keep working for a while. Did museum consults. Wrote a short article titled, "The Nose as Instrument, a Memoir in Sense." It was rejected with a kind letter. Smell-based diagnostics are no longer considered reliable. You laughed. Then coughed. One day, a young woman knocked on your door. Fresh-faced. Bright eyes. She introduced herself as a student, studying environmental toxins. She'd found your name in an old newspaper clipping and asked, timidly, "Do you still remember how to sniff wallpaper?" You nodded. Of course you did. It doesn't leave you. You gave her your notebook, one of the older ones. She held it like a holy text. "This is incredible," she said. "We've lost the language of it." You smiled and told her that every room tells a story if you know how to breathe in the right places. She promised to scan the notes, to preserve them. You told her that was kind. She asked what the worst smell had ever been. You paused. "Hope. Just before it turns sour." She didn't write that down. You don't go out as much now. The city's changed. The streets are brighter, the house is cleaner, the wallpaper's dull. Safety has a color now, beige. Sometimes you wonder if people miss the glamour, the shimmer of danger, the way light danced on green patterns like they were alive. Maybe they do. You sit by the fire one evening with a cup of weak tea and unfold an old clipping from a pattern catalog. Garden's breath, new for spring. The page is faded. You remember the scent exactly. You tried to write a few more entries after you stopped sniffing. Tried to catalog the memories by season, by neighborhood, by sickness. But it all started to blur. So you stopped. Now you collect something else, letters. You receive them from people who once called you foolish, or dramatic, or worse. Most are short. "We removed the wallpaper. You were right." Others longer. "My son recovered. I hadn't realized how sick he was until the room changed." One family sent you a pressed violet, wrapped in silk. "From the garden that replaced the nursery. It still smells faintly sweet." Quirky truth? You've kept every wallpaper sample you ever judged as lethal. Not because you're morbid. Because no one else would. You lock them in sealed tins, labeled meticulously. Sometimes you open one, very carefully, and inhale just a whisper. Not enough to hurt. Just enough to remember. There are still a few old homes with the original wallpaper intact, hidden beneath layers of paint, or sealed in glass by museums who now consider it historical. You visit one on occasion. The guide says, "Of course, this wallpaper is infamous for its arsenic content, but no one's been harmed in over a century." You nod. You don't mention the twitch in your nose. Because even now, even after all this time, it knows. And you realize that what you and the other sniffers did wasn't futile. It was foundational. You were the bridge between suspicion and science. You carried the stories of walls. You were the sense that society ignored, until it couldn't. One afternoon, you returned to your childhood home. It's empty now. Dusty. A bit hollow. The walls have been stripped bare, painted over. But you know what was there. You lean your face to the wall in your old room. Inhale. Nothing. Then something. Memory. It's not arsenic. It's not poison. Just a trace of old paper and lavender and ink. The residue of care. Of fear. Of work that mattered. You straighten, smile, and whisper to no one in particular. Still got it. Because even though the job is gone, and the world moved on, the last sniffer still remembers what danger smells like. And what safety finally feels like. The hallway is narrow and quiet, dust swirling in the late afternoon light like forgotten perfume. You place your hand gently against the wall, a soft, beige thing now, dull and harmless. But behind it? You know what used to be there. You always will. These are the ghosts in the drawing room. It starts as a whisper. Someone's aunt falls ill after moving into a flat. Doctors blame the weather, the smog, or the faintness of Victorian constitutions. But someone else remembers, didn't that flat have the old wallpaper? You walk by a boarding house one evening and swear the breeze carries that bitter almond scent. Just a note. Just a suggestion. You pause. Sniff again. Nothing. But your muscles tense all the same. Some part of you believes the paper remembers. And perhaps it does. Because not all arsenic walls were removed. Some were painted over, sealed beneath plaster, papered over again. You know of one house where 5 layers of wallpaper were peeled away, each older and darker, like tree rings made of toxicity. At the core? A pattern called Emerald Veil. You'd logged it in your 3rd notebook. The room was cold. The air made you dizzy. You still think of it when you feel a headache creep from behind your eyes. Historians still argue whether arsenic wallpaper left a permanent mark. Whether its particles remain dormant, waiting for moisture, for peeling, for heat to awaken them. Science says probably not. But experience says maybe. One museum attempted to display a restored arsenic room under glass, labeled with warnings. 3 docents fell ill. Coincidence, they said? You weren't so sure. Even today, calls come in, fewer, quieter. From curious landlords, antique shop owners, history-minded decorators. We found something odd in the attic. They begin. Could you come take a look? You always go. Not out of duty. Out of instinct. Once, in an old hotel near Bath, you were led to a room sealed for decades. The air was stale, the furniture draped in sheets. The wallpaper, a deep vine print, clung in patches like it was trying not to be forgotten. You didn't need to sniff. You knew. The young couple showing you around asked, "Is it dangerous?" You looked at them, saw the fresh paint samples in their hands, the hope in their faces. Not anymore, you said. But you made a note in your book, reseal this room. Then there are the people who claim their houses are haunted, not by spirits, but by smells. There's a scent in the nursery, they say. Only at night. You nod. Ask for a sample. They send yellowing paper flecked with green. Sometimes it still reacts. Sometimes it doesn't. But always, you remember that not all hauntings need ghosts. Quirky story? A novelist once consulted you while researching a murder mystery. She wanted to kill a character with wallpaper. You told her it had been done, by history. She sent you a signed copy. The dedication read, "To the nose that caught the killer." Now, when you walk into a stranger's home, you still look at the walls first. Not the furniture. Not the faces. The paper. The patterns. You never stop seeing them. Never stopped listening to the quiet hum of potential danger humming beneath the print. Sometimes, in a crowded room, you catch a scent that doesn't belong, old glue, mold, something chemical and sweet. You stiffen. The people around you keep talking, unaware. But your body remembers. Even if no one calls you sniffer anymore. There's an old house you visit each spring, abandoned now, slated for demolition. Ivy creeps through broken windows. The walls sag inward like breath held too long. You step inside, find your favorite room. Forest waltz, pale green, sun-faded. It was once considered deadly. You sit in the middle of the floor, close your eyes, and breathe. Nothing. And yet everything. This is your cathedral. Your memory vault. Your wallpapered past. Because even when the patterns are gone, the people they touched remain. The girl in the nursery. The mother with shaking hands. The maid who fainted by the stove. The sniffer who taught you what copper smells like in a warm room. You whisper their names to the dust. And then you leave, soft-footed and quiet, like a scent slipping through a cracked window. You pass a family on the street, watching as they move into a freshly painted home. The children race to choose rooms. The parents hold hands and smile. You don't say anything. You just nod and walk on, trusting the walls to behave. Because now, they usually do. But just in case, you still carry the sachet. You still carry the kit. And somewhere, behind the beige and blush and trendy taupe, beneath the minimalism and gloss finish, those ghosts wait patiently. Just in case they're ever needed again. And now, the fog settles. The boots are off. The satchel is closed. The green patterns have faded into grays and shadows, and you sit in the soft hush of a room that no longer whispers danger. The walls, once so alive with menace, are quiet now, just walls again. You breathe slowly. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. No trace of almonds. No chemical bite. Only the familiar comfort of clean air and the low hum of nothing at all. Your coat hangs by the door. Your notebook rests on the table, its last page filled. There's no more to add. The stories have all been told, the rooms all walked, the wallpaper all catalogued. What's left now is memory, edges worn, corners curled, but still vivid when you close your eyes. You think of the people you helped, and the ones you couldn't. The rooms you saved, and the ones you had to leave. The lives changed by something no one could see, until someone was brave enough to smell. Your eyes begin to close. The air is still. The background hum of the fan lulls you deeper. Whatever haunted the wallpaper has passed on now, and what's left is just sleep. Long, gentle sleep. So rest now, quiet and safe, knowing the walls are kind tonight. You're done sniffing. The world can breathe. And so can you.